right, welcome everyone to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today we have a great show for you today. We have Scott Graves joining us today, Director of Research with the California Budget and Policy Center. Scott, thanks for joining us. How's it going?
It's going well. Thank you for inviting the Budget Center to be on today.
Yeah, our pleasure. Can you, I guess, give us a little background on you and kind of what the Budget Center is and what's your kind of policy objectives?
Sure. I'm the Director of Research at the Budget Center, as we call ourselves for short. We've been around since the mid-90s. We used to be the California Budget Project, but we changed our name a few years ago to reflect the fact that we focus broadly on budget and policy issues that aim to improve the lives of low and middle income Californians. That's the work we've been doing for around 25 years, and we hope to have another 25 years ahead of us doing the same good work.
Very interesting, very interesting. And I guess, how did you get into the role of becoming the Director of Research for this think tank?
Yeah, I started as a policy analyst with the Budget Center back in 2002. So I'm going into year 18 now, I guess, with the organization. And it just sort of like, moved up the ladder and an opportunity came up. We created a new Director of Research position and I stepped into the role. And it's been very rewarding. And I work with a great group of really smart people who want to make the lives of all Californians better.
Yeah, I guess the California budget has always been, something that's been interesting in the last, 10 years, especially since, coming out of the last recession. Then we've had some good years with tax increases, surpluses, and now here we are in, kind of that rainy day that we were preparing for. I guess, how well prepared were we, I guess, for 2020, and kind of what are you seeing for 2021?
Well, I would say that California's rainy day fund, if we can kind of go a little bit wonky here at the outset, is probably one of the best kept secrets of state government. I think that when a lot of people think of politicians or Sacramento politicians, they don't necessarily get the sense that there's a lot of fiscal responsibility, or at least that's the stereotype. I'm here to tell you that the stereotype is wrong in that respect. Our policymakers in the legislature, back when Governor Brown was serving, I think he was in his third term at that point, back in 2014, right. They decided that they didn't want to enter the next recession with nothing in the piggy bank, as had happened during several prior recessions, when in that situation, all you're left with is a choice between, cuts and tax increases or some combination of the two. So this idea to strengthen California's rainy day fund came out of discussions in the legislature. They put it on the ballot before we, the people, the voters, back in 2014, and we gave it the thumbs up. We said, yes, let's strengthen our rainy day fund, and that's exactly what we did. We put some teeth into it. We made it mandatory to put money in. We made it hard to take money out, restrictive circumstances. And also, our state leaders actually put billions more into this rainy day fund than they were actually required to by Proposition 2, which went into the state constitution. So as a result of that, we came into this recession we're living through now that's affecting so many Californians with $16 billion in our piggy bank, which helped to offset the need for large-scale austerity cuts in the budget that they just put into place a couple months ago. We took $8 billion out of the fund, used it to help support critical programs and services. So I think it's really important that all Californians, we like to complain about government, right? We always kind of focus on the negatives, but this is a situation where we can actually say, they thought ahead, they did the right thing, squirreled away some money for a rainy day. The rainy day came. I mean, it was a hurricane. It wasn't just a rainstorm, right? We're all living through a hurricane right now, some worse than others. But they did the right thing. And as a result, we had dollars to draw down from a fund that could help support really critical services and offset the need for austerity cuts. Going into next year, naturally, our rainy day fund is smaller. We used some of it this year, but we have around $8 billion still sitting in that piggy bank that can be used to help get us through this budget crisis.
Have you guys started looking at, I guess, projections, or started seeing, I guess, the receipts coming in quarterly for 2021? Obviously, people are assuming that incomes are going to be way down, and therefore taxes are going to be way down. Have you seen any sort of projections or any thoughts of what 2021 budget's going to look like?
Yeah, well, the state government is required to produce multi-year projections as part of every budget cycle. They're required to look 2 or 3 years ahead. And so the governor's Department of Finance is forecasting that the state, just under current law, if we do nothing else, make no further changes, the state is running a structural budget shortfall, meaning year in, year out, we're projected to spend more money than we're going to take in. That's called a structural budget gap.
Hmm.
So, on the plate of state policymakers when they come back in 2021 is how do we address that state budget gap while still making the policy choices we need to move California forward, in recognition of the fact that millions of people have lost jobs, have lost income, their household budgets have shrunk, they're hanging by a thread, a lot of families. So there's going to be a tension there between the desire to just get the budget balanced and to actually make some critical policy decisions that are needed in order to support families in this time of crisis.
I guess one thing you said you guys looked into was, I guess, how these budgets affect, the middle class folks here in California. And that's something that's been talked about a lot. This kind of growing, I guess, social unrest or kind of sour mood. And we're seeing it nationally. A lot of people are attributing this to a shrinking middle class. And I guess what are the things you're seeing, affecting the middle class now? And I guess how can, this state, help grow that middle class?
Yeah, well, a lot of this has to do with the state's ability to contribute to the creation of jobs that will pay a living wage or more than a living wage. So that's why it's crucial that we have in place policies that really support families at the lower end of the wage scale, because when you do that, when you raise the lower end, essentially you're lifting everyone's boat, right? If you're raising the minimum wage, it's having sort of ripple effects all the way up the income scale. So I think it's important to keep in mind that we're all, it's kind of a cliche now, we're all in this together, but, really we are, for the most part, the middle class people living on lower wages, we really are all in this together. And so to the extent that we can help lift up all families, then everyone is going to do better. Now, education is a perfect example of this. This is an area where, we have over 6 million kids in California schools. A lot of them are coming from households with lower incomes, but a lot of them are coming from middle and upper income households as well. And everyone wants their children to have a solid public education. But we're looking at, unfortunately, a state budget situation where the state is delaying billions of dollars in payments to our public schools as a way of helping to address our state budget crisis, but is putting local school districts in some very difficult fiscal straits. And in fact, the school districts that have less funding to draw on, typically those with serving lower income populations, are the ones that are going to be hurt the most by this. So this is just one of those situations where it's really important to realize that the kinds of decisions we make that are going to lift families up at the lower end are actually going to help all of us moving forward across time, as well as across the entire state.
I guess one interesting thing that's been talked about recently is, I guess, California by law has to spend 40% of its budget on education, and yet we are one of the lowest, I guess, per capita spenders on education. Can you talk about, I guess, how California could do better on spending on education, and why aren't we meeting those per capita needs that are equal to or better than other states?
This really, we say all the time, budgets are about values and priorities. They answer the question, what kind of California do you want to live in when you're putting together a state budget? Essentially what has happened is that other states, not all of them, but many, have decided that they wanted to invest more robustly in their public education systems. As a result, they've raised taxes or set up their budgets in a way that they're directing relatively more dollars to their public education system than has happened in California. Of course, a big reason for California sort of slipping in those rankings is Proposition 13, which voters passed back in 1978. And basically capped the property tax, which up to that point had been the primary way that public schools were funded. And so we ended up with a situation where much more funding now was coming from the state, and still is, to support our public schools. So, one answer to this is to look for additional revenues, at the state level that can be directed to public education. In fact, there is a ballot measure that the Budget Center did an analysis of, a set of analyses, Proposition 15, which is proposing to reform the commercial property tax side of Proposition 13, leaving residential aside, not going to touch homeowners, but on the commercial and industrial side, it would actually allow properties to be taxed at their full market value, as opposed to being taxed at values that go back 20, 30, or 40 years. So that would direct substantial new revenues to a range of local services, including K-12 schools, if the voters approve it this November. That would be billions of additional dollars on top of the funds that are already coming through, as you noted, our complex system of funding public education in California. So that's an example of one way in which voters have an opportunity to say, we actually want to provide more funding to our K-12 education system. Prop 15 is one way to do it.
You just kind of made an interesting point. By looking at a state's budget, you can see, I guess, the values or what's important to that state. If you were to take an outside look at the California budget, I guess, what do you see as our priorities here in California?
Yeah, when you look at where, well, just to back up a little bit, the state budget is kind of a complicated beast, but most people think of it in terms of what's known as the general fund budget. Whenever we're in a budget crisis, we're always hearing about the general fund, and those are dollars that can be used pretty much by any purpose allowed by law, unless they're required to be directed to certain places. Like, for example, some funding through the general fund has to go to support K-12 education. So that's one example. But when you sort of add it all up and look at the general fund, around 70 cents out of every dollar that we spend through the general fund is essentially going to education or health and human services. So on the education side, that would be K-12 schools. It also includes community colleges, the CSU, and the University of California. Health and human services, it's largely about providing health care to families with low incomes through the Medi-Cal program. That's our state's version of Medicaid at the federal level. So, and we also provide other types of social services like foster care and child welfare services, things like that. So if you're trying to get a sense of where are these dollars going that we're spending in California, they're really going where the voters say they want them to go. They want them to go to education, and they want them to go to support families who are in need, in order to ensure that we're all sort of able to take advantage of the prosperity that our economy creates here in California.
There's been a lot of talk recently about, I guess, about technologies and certain, I guess, disruptive technologies and things like that, maybe ways, things that could be done better, more efficiently. Are you seeing anything that the state could be doing better, which could help save money and make these processes more efficient?
Yeah, that's a tough one. To answer off the top of my head, I think there are always going to be opportunities for efficiencies. I don't think anyone should ever get complacent and say, we're doing everything now as best as we can possibly do it, and we can never make any changes that will improve things. I would not ever want to hear anyone say that.
Right.
So I think there are probably, yes. I think the answer is probably yes, you're right. I think a lot of it is probably, on the margins of, potential savings. I mean, one thing that we often forget in California is that we do have ways to save substantial tax dollars and redirect them to other things we think are higher priorities. And what I'm going to point to here is our state prison system. We spend over $13 billion per year on 34 state prisons that house over 100,000 individuals. We've been implementing criminal justice reforms in recent years. We've, in part because we wanted to, and also because federal courts told us we had to.
Right.
So we have brought that number down substantially. But despite the fact that we've been reducing our criminal justice population in California at the state level, we really haven't seen a lot of savings yet. threat to the state budget. And that's largely because we're still operating 34 very expensive state prisons. So really, if we, and in the budget that the legislature passed this year and the governor signed, they required the governor to come back in January and explain how he's going to move toward closing 2 state prisons. So they've actually put this on the agenda now, that they are requiring the administration to point toward 2 prisons that we can close within the next several years. My organization would argue that they can go farther. They have opportunities to close more state prisons. Over time, we would save billions of dollars, probably much more than you could save through various efficiencies, which was, I know, what you were aiming for with this question. But that would be a way where over time, we could take tax dollars that we're already generating with our current tax system and that are going in a place that we probably don't need to be spending so much money, and redirect it to things that we think are really important needs in the coming years.
You know, a lot of legislators, I guess, have goals or things that they want to accomplish. And one we keep hearing is this kind of Medi-Cal for all. Is that something your policy center has looked at, this kind of universal health care? And, you know, how possible is that within the state's budget?
Yeah, so we have looked at this in many different ways, as have other organizations. In fact, this legislature recently created what's called the Healthy California for All Commission, which is actually looking into this very question. They call it a unified system of financing for healthcare, which is kind of another way of saying single payer, which is kind of how people understand it. But there are different ways of conceptualizing this. But you know, my organization would be in favor of having California move toward a more rational and just form of providing healthcare. The system we have now works for a lot of people, but it does not work for everyone. And to get back to your question about efficiencies, this is an area in which we have a lot of inefficiencies, and it's been pointed out again and again by healthcare economists. So the problem that you have in moving toward a system like this is that you end up having to sort of create something new and encourage people who currently have health care through their employers, which is how most Californians are getting their health care, encouraging them or giving them the idea that it's going to be a lot better to move over to another system. And in fact, in the long run, or maybe even in the short run, it will be less money out of your pocket. So it's really asking a lot of people to take a leap of faith, which is why when this was coming up 2 or 3 years ago, when various advocacy groups in Sacramento were pushing pretty hard for having California adopt a single payer healthcare system, it was stopped in the state assembly. But we were arguing this is not the kind of issue where it's like flipping on a light switch, right? It's not something you can do overnight. It's a really important goal to have. We should be setting up a system that spends dollars wisely and provides healthcare to everyone as a right. And not as something as you can access only because you have the right job. But in order to get there, you need to take concrete steps and understand what should those steps be and in what sequence. That's actually what the Healthy California for All Commission is looking into, although newsflash, they just reported recently that they're going on hiatus for various reasons. So they're not going to be continuing their work for the next few months, but I believe they intend to pick it up next year. And of course, the other thing here is California really has no realistic option for implementing a single payer healthcare system without a friendly administration in Washington, D.C. So a lot of this is going to depend on the outcome of the November election. Will President Trump be elected, or will we have a President Biden who would take a much different approach toward a California coming to him and saying, hey, we'd like to use some federal dollars in our new single payer healthcare system. Is that all right? How can we do that?
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and get those much needed waivers you'd need. You know, we just finished a legislative session. We had a lot of trailer bills come down the pike. Kind of, you know, what did you think about this year's, I guess, budget bills, and kind of which ones do you think did well, and which ones do you think kind of missed the mark and, you know, are going to need some work next year?
Yeah, well, I know this I'm not going to go on as long as I could on this one. There's a lot on both sides, right? It was a really tough year for policymakers to make significant headway. Although there was some really effective advocacy, pushing the message that we needed action not just out of Washington D.C. but also out of policymakers in Sacramento. So if I could just highlight 1 or 2 things on the positive side. many folks may not be aware that California has what's called an earned income tax credit.
Right.
It's a refundable credit that's provided to low-wage workers. You can't be making more than $30,000 a year, for example. And it provides anywhere from hundreds to the low thousands of dollars sort of on an annual basis. This is for basically low-wage working families. But we have, since the beginning, when we implemented this Cali ITC, we've excluded various immigrant populations. So there was a big push this year to say, especially at a time when COVID-19, is having a detrimental impact on, Latinx populations, on undocumented Californians, and they're basically locked out of any relief coming out of Washington, D.C. This is the time when California should be stepping up and trying to undo policies of the past that left people out of important social assistance just because of who they were. So back in June, the legislature said, let's expand the Cali ITC to these excluded families if they have kids under age 5. So that was part of the population. And the governor agreed to that. In August, so just last month, they came back and they said, actually, let's expand it to the whole population as part of revisions to the budget they made. So that bill is sitting on Governor Newsom's desk, and he has not indicated, at least publicly, whether he's going to sign it. He has until September 30th to sign that bill. So that's one sort of on the positive side. Mm-hmm. Where things didn't go as we had hoped and many advocates had hoped, go as planned. There was a push among advocates to expand Medi-Cal health coverage to undocumented seniors, right? These are people who are probably most affected by COVID-19, by complications from that disease, and have the greatest potential of dying if they get it, but they are locked out of affordable health care coverage simply because of their immigration status. There was a big push to try to get that policy through the legislature and to the governor's desk this year. They decided not to move forward with that. We found that very disappointing, but we are hopeful that policymakers will consider taking it up again in 2021.
I know a lot of our listeners are state employees, and this year they received a little cut in their salaries, and dealing with the days of 2000 to 2008, 2007 to 2008-9, where we had the furloughs, the 15% pay cuts. I guess, how are you seeing this in 2021? Are state employees going to continue having to see cuts? Are we going to continue seeing cuts in state administration? Or do you see things turning around?
I wish I had my crystal ball out. I hesitate to speculate in any way. There are so many uncertainties, so many unknowns right now. I may have neglected to say in an answer to an earlier question that revenues actually did come in a little bit better in July than the state policymakers had been expecting. So that's good news, right? That perhaps our revenue situation may be a bit better than we thought. But that is, we can't hang our hat on that, right? It's very unlikely that the situation would turn around to the degree where we could say, oh, everything is fine, now revenues have come back. That's not the way things have been going for various reasons, in part because of the way the pandemic has been handled at the federal level. So it does seem like that we're in for another year at least of relatively tough decisions that policymakers in Sacramento are going to have to make. They're going to have to be thinking about, they have to balance the budget. California is not the federal government. We can't run a deficit, so we have to figure out how we actually balance the books. One way to do that, it does not move California forward, but it would be to make austerity cuts, and that is not something that we would recommend. We would not want to see that. We would not want to see more cuts in the next state budget, at least not beyond, some certain threshold. So the other option that policymakers have, in addition to drawing down the funds that remain in our rainy day reserve, is to look toward new opportunities to raise taxes. And here, let me just point out a couple things on raising revenues. In terms of corporations in California, corporations today are paying less of their income in taxes, in state taxes, than they did a generation ago, back in the 1980s. And they received a very large tax cut at the federal level based on the tax reduction measure that Congress passed and President Trump signed into law back in late 2017. So corporations, large corporations, are doing very well, and they're actually paying as a share of their income less in taxes than they were a generation ago. We also don't tax wealth in California for individuals. We have over 160 billionaires in California who saw their collective net worth rise by more than $200 billion since the start of the pandemic. Okay, these are situations in which you see corporations, some individuals doing very well, while millions of Californians are wondering how they're going to pay the rent and how they're going to buy groceries. So we just see this as an opportunity for policymakers in Sacramento to take a really serious look at our state's tax structure and ask, is it working and is it meeting the dire needs that we have today to bring assistance to all Californians, especially in an effort to lift up those who are most affected, families working in low-wage jobs, Black families, Latinx folks, and undocumented workers as well.
I guess turning to 2021 as well, kind of what things are you looking at and what things is your group going to be pushing next year?
So in addition to, thinking about how we provide healthcare in California, not the big single payer question, but are there opportunities to expand Medi-Cal health coverage to certain populations that continue to be excluded? It's going to be really important that policymakers focus on housing. Housing is probably the single biggest expense that most Californians have. Many households are just hanging by a thread. We've seen protections for renters, and in case your listeners aren't aware, the governor did sign a bill on August 31st that extends for 5 months some protections from eviction for renters who are unable to pay their full rent due to the COVID-19 crisis and loss of jobs and income. But that temporary relief is going to expire again on February 1st. So there's going to be an opportunity, or actually not an opportunity, a requirement for, when they reassemble next year, for policymakers in Sacramento to really get serious about how we're going to, as a state, address the dire needs of Californians to pay for housing. Some people are going to be faced potentially with small claims court cases filed by landlords for back rent. They're going to have difficulty paying the rent after February 1st. So we're kind of going to be back in that mix. And, we have to say all this knowing that California is not an island, right? We have the largest population in the nation. We have the biggest economy in the United States among the states. But we can't do all of this by ourselves, right? There are significant limitations on any state's ability to solve a crisis of these proportions. So what the federal government is really the only governmental entity in our country that has the wherewithal to provide the solutions that are needed to match the scale of the crisis. And because Washington, D.C. has been falling short, we have not seen the kinds of solutions that we need in an ongoing way that are going to really lift people up and help get our economy moving again, and not just to recover, to go back to where we were, but to restructure in a way that we lift up the people who have been left behind for so many generations. So it's really important that, as Californians wonder, well, what are those Sacramento politicians going to do about this crisis next year? That's a really important question. But we also need to be asking, what is the federal government going to be doing about this? Because that's where some of the biggest solutions, including helping renters pay for housing, is going to have to come from.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, I guess, some other crisis that we've been dealing with for the past 3 or 4 years, wildfires. we seem to not be able to escape this. We've devoted large portions of the budget to this the past 3 or 4 years, and it doesn't seem to be helping at all. Kind of, I guess, what are you seeing towards wildfires, and what part of the budget is this going to be going forward, and is there any solutions that we can see here that will enable us not to have one of these big fire seasons one of these years?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely not the climate scientist here, so that would be a great topic for a future podcast. But I think the reality is that this is just one of those sort of unfortunately new expenditures that we're just going to see being built into the state budget every year. I think the policymakers have gotten the idea that this isn't a one and done thing. It used to be that you'd have a big fire and maybe 20 years would go by and you'd have another one. My mom lives in Sonoma County. She's been under fire threat for 4 years in a row now.
Right.
And a lot of Californians are living through the same crisis, and the argument that, is there's a very strong case to be made that this is tied back to climate change. And so California can do some things to try to get its arms around dealing with climate change, but this is where we need a national approach. In fact, we need a worldwide approach, obviously. Right. But it's hard to know, and I'm not the expert here that's able to say, what California should do in the short term. It doesn't seem like it's something that resolves itself anytime soon. There's got to be planning that's going on to try to address this, among the experts. But in terms of like the budget question here, if that's sort of where your question was leading, right, as well, is that the reality is that it's sort of a new, relatively meaty expenditure in the state budget that we might not have seen before. So we're going to have planned expenses higher than we thought. And as each year goes by, we may find ourselves having to put more money into that part of the budget, because if these fires continue like they've been going, it's just going to get more and more expensive to address them.
No, definitely. Well, Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. If any of our listeners wanted to follow some of your work, how's the best way to kind of follow what you're doing and get in touch with you?
So I would say just check out our website, calbudgetcenter.org. You can find our entire team on there. You'll find me. We're easy to get a hold of by email, of course, where none of us are actually in our office during the pandemic.
Right.
So we're all working from home, but we're all doing the same good work that we've always done.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. Pleasure talking with you, and look forward to speaking with you again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
Right. Thanks for listening to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Make sure to like and subscribe on our YouTube page, hit that notification bell, or rate or review wherever you listen to this podcast. Thanks to our producers, Phil and Vernon, and we'll be back to you on Friday. Thank you.
Some are called dreamers.